High Provisioner Vrak of the Krell Imperium regarded the holographic display of the third planet with a feeling of profound clinical pity. The world, which its noisy, chaotic inhabitants called Earth, was a vibrant, messy swirl of blue, white, and green. It was, in Vrak's considered opinion, a tragedy of inefficiency. It was a planet suffering from a terminal case of itself. The Krell, as a civilization, had transcended the vulgarities of physical conflict. They had not fired a weapon in anger in 500 of their long, placid generations. War, they had concluded, was a failure of logic. It was the crude, barbaric thrashing of a species that had not yet mastered the simple, elegant art of logistics. The Krell did not wage war. They simply and benevolently corrected imbalances, and humanity was the greatest imbalance they had ever encountered. Vrak was a master of this art, a provisioner general whose title was not one of conquest, but of stewardship. His flagship, the Abundant Harvest, was not a dreadnought. It was a sterile, seed-shaped bioengineering vessel, a floating laboratory of immense power. His weapons were not lasers or kinetic slugs. His weapon was a perfectly tailored retrovirus, a masterpiece of genetic engineering he called the Nul-Blight. He had deployed it 23 times before, against 23 lesser dissonant species, and the result was always the same: a clean, bloodless, and logical victory. The Krell as a species were highly specialized. Their biology could process only a single, narrow spectrum of plant-based proteins, derived from a genus of crystalline flora native to their homeworld. As such, their entire philosophy was built around the sanctity and vulnerability of a food supply. To them, the most civilized way to neutralize a threat was to demonstrate this vulnerability. The Nul-Blight was a work of art, a scalpel of unimaginable precision. It was designed to target and neutralize the dominant, cultivated food source of a given planet. For the inhabitants of Earth, his logic artisans had identified a primary, staggering vulnerability. For all their supposed diversity, for all their chaotic noise, over 70% of their caloric intake, the very foundation of their global civilization, came from a single, primitive, and wildly inefficient family of plants, Potsy. The grasses, wheat, rice, corn, barley, oats. Vrak found this specialization to be an almost suicidal lack of foresight. They had built a pyramid of global civilization on a single, fragile point. He was not an invader. He was a doctor here, to prove a theorem. "Launch the dispersal vectors," Vrak commanded, his voice a series of soft, resonant chimes. His crew, tall, slender beings with pale, chlorophyll-tinged skin and large, placid dark eyes, moved with unhurried grace. From the Abundant Harvest, 1,000 iridescent seed-like pods were released into the upper atmosphere. They were not bombs. They were gifts, designed to dissolve harmlessly, releasing their microscopic payload into the planet's jet streams. The Nul-Blight would do the rest. It was programmed to seek out the specific genetic markers of the Poaceae family and trigger a total systemic and immediate metabolic collapse. The crops would not just die, they would liquefy, dissolving into a sterile reddish-brown nutrient-void sludge. "Begin the 90-day chronometer," Vrak chimed, "and engage the veil. We will observe the process." The Abundant Harvest shimmered, its hull bending the light around it, and vanished from all of the primitive human sensor arrays. Vrak settled into his observation throne, prepared to watch the inevitable three-act play of a logical siege. First, the panic. Second, the resource hoarding and inevitable societal collapse. And third, the final, desperate, and grateful broadcast of surrender. He was a patient, civilized being. He would wait. Elias Thorne pressed a delicate mother-of-pearl spoon into a perfect quenelle of Acetra caviar, balanced it on a blini of unheard-of lightness, and placed it on the plate. He was not a cook. He was a god, and his 2 Michelin-star restaurant, Terroir, was the temple where he practiced his art. Elias was a man obsessed with a single idea. That food was a story of the land, the terroir. He had built his reputation on his obsessive, almost fanatical dedication to provenance. His wheat was from a single family-owned farm in Kansas. His corn, used for his signature 8-hour polenta affumicata, was from a heritage strand in Oaxaca. His rice for his delicate Sakles-cured sashimi accompaniments was a strain of koshihikari grown in the volcanic soil of a specific mountain in Japan. His entire, high-strung, beautiful, and obscenely expensive world was balanced on the single perfect point of his supply chain. The first reports were just noise, a background inconvenience, a strange new agricultural rust in China. He'd dismissed it. Then 2 days later, his supplier in Japan had called, his voice a choked, terrified whisper. The rice paddies were gone. Not diseased, not withered. Gone. They had, in the space of a single night, dissolved into a thick, red, bubbling slime that smelled of rotted copper. The phenomenon was global. It was an agricultural apocalypse. The world's bread baskets, the vast rolling fields of wheat in Kansas and Ukraine, the endless golden plains of corn in Iowa, the ancient terraced rice paddies of Asia, all of it in 72 hours ceased to be. The Poaceae family had been deleted from the planet. The stock market, a machine built on the assumption of grain futures, did not crash. It evaporated. The global economy, a construct built on the back of cheap, plentiful calories, ceased to exist. Elias stood in the silent, perfect kitchen of Terroir. The restaurant was empty. The city outside was a symphony of sirens and, increasingly, the high-pitched, frantic screams of pure panic. His phone, which had been buzzing with 1,000 cancellations, was now a dead, useless brick. The power grid, overloaded by the panic and the subsequent immediate collapse of the biofuel sector that relied on corn, had failed. He was a god in a dark, silent temple. He looked at his pantry, a room that had once held the rarest and most perfect ingredients on earth. He saw bags of heritage flour, sacks of arborio rice, containers of fine polenta. They were not just ingredients anymore, they were relics. They were the last useless remnants of a world that no longer existed. He picked up a handful of the Kansas wheat, a beautiful, hard, red winter wheat he had paid a fortune for. It was just dust. He let it run through his fingers. A man who had built his life on the story of the land, he was now, for the first time, completely, totally, and terrifyingly hungry. The riots started that night. Elias barricaded the steel door of his kitchen, listening to the sound of his perfect artisanal floor-to-ceiling windows shattering as the mob, no longer patrons but a desperate, starving mass, flooded his dining room. He sat in the dark, his back against a cold stainless steel prep counter, and clutched a heavy carbon steel chef's knife, his mind a perfect, cold, empty blank. Dr. Eva Rostova, a senior geneticist for the USDA's Agricultural Defense Division, had not slept in 4 days. Her subterranean Bio-Level 4 lab in Fort Detrick was one of the few places on the continent that still had independent, hardened power. Her world had shrunk to the glowing, holographic display of a gene sequencer and the terrifying, beautiful, and utterly alien structure of the retrovirus. It was a masterpiece. It was a weapon of such profound genius that a part of her, the scientist, was in absolute terrified awe. It was a vector delivered by a self-replicating airborne phage that carried a simple, devastating payload, a strand of synthetic RNA that targeted the ribulose 1,5-bisphosphate carboxylase oxygenase, the rubisco enzyme, that was common only to the Poaceae family. It was the genetic key to photosynthesis for grasses, and the Nul-Blight was a key that simply and permanently turned that enzyme off. The plants, unable to process sunlight, consumed themselves in a wave of catastrophic metabolic failure, their very cells rupturing and dissolving into a sterile, oxidized sludge. "It's a sniper rifle," she whispered, her voice raw, to the blurry, panicked face of General Miller on her screen. Miller was in the Aegis bunker, one of the last nodes of the old government. "It's not a shotgun. It's a single perfect bullet aimed at the heart of our entire civilization." "Can you stop it, Rostova?" Miller demanded, his voice tight with the strain of a man watching his world burn. "Can you make a cure? A counteragent?" Eva shook her head, rubbing her burning eyes. Cure it? General, the atmosphere is saturated with the phage. It's in the soil, the water, the air, it's everywhere. We can't cure it because it's already done its job. We can't grow wheat. We can't grow corn. We can't grow rice. Ever again. The grass, family is, for all intents and purposes, extinct. The general's face went pale. So that's it, he whispered. Checkmate. They'll starve us out. No, Eva said, a new, strange, and frantic thought beginning to form. No, you don't understand. She pulled up another data set, a global botanical survey. They're precise, General, they're too precise. They targeted the Posi family. They didn't touch the Solanaceae. The what? Miller barked. Potatoes, Eva said, her voice rising with a strange hysterical energy. Tomatoes, peppers, eggplant. They didn't touch the Fabaceae, the beans, the peas, the soybeans. They didn't touch the Brassicaceae, broccoli, cabbage, kale, mustard. They didn't touch the Amaranthaceae, quinoa, amaranth, spinach. They didn't touch fungi. They didn't touch anything in the ocean. They took out our staples, General. They took out the cheap, easy, mass-produced calories that we feed our cattle and turn into high-fructose corn syrup. They declared war on Twinkies. The General was silent, processing this. So, we can still grow food? We can grow all of our food, Eva corrected him, except for the big three. But that's the problem. The infrastructure is gone. The supply chains are dead. The global shipping network, the electrical grid that powers the farms, the fuel for the trucks, it's all gone. We have the food, but we have no way to get it to the people. The people in the cities are going to starve to death, surrounded by a world that is still, technically, edible. Elias Thorne had survived the fall of his city. His temple of gastronomy, terroir, had been looted, burned, and reduced to a concrete shell. He had escaped with nothing but the clothes on his back, his set of carbon steel knives, and a primal gnawing hunger that was fast becoming the only thought in his head. He was walking west, out of the burning urban sprawl, with a small, ragged band of other survivors. They were accountants, lawyers, and tech bros, men and women whose high-level, specialized skills were now as useless as his own. They were all starving. The grocery stores were skeletal, picked clean in the first 12 hours. The world had become a desperate, hungry, and very dangerous place. On the third day of their exodus, a woman in the group, a hedge fund manager named Sarah, collapsed. She was done. Malnutrition and dehydration had taken their toll. Just leave me, she whispered, her voice dry. I can't walk. The rest of the group looked at her, then at each other, their faces a mask of desperate primal calculus. Elias looked at the woman, then at the patch of scruffy, untamed earth beside the highway. He saw a burst of yellow flowers that the city gardeners had always tried to poison. He saw the broad, serrated leaves of Taraxacum officinale, the dandelion. He saw the heart-shaped leaves of wood sorrel. He saw the bright, cheerful, defiant purple of wild clover. The Krell, in their infinite logical wisdom, had targeted the grasses. And in doing so, they had inadvertently created a global paradise for the broadleaf weeds that had always been suppressed by them. With their primary competitors gone, the dandelions and amaranth were flourishing, energized by the nutrient-rich sludge of the dead grasses. Elias, the man who had once sourced a specific, single-origin peppercorn from a mountain in Peru, knelt in the dirt. He plucked a young, tender dandelion green. He tasted it. It was bitter, peppery, complex. It was terroir. It was the taste of the land. His eyes, dead and hollow from starvation, suddenly lit with a cold, clear, analytical fire. He was a chef. And a chef at his core was not an artist. He was a scavenger. Don't move, he said. He walked into the scruffy patch of weeds, his knife, which had been his only weapon, now becoming his primary tool. He harvested the dandelion greens, the sorrel, the clover. He dug in the dirt, his bare hands finding the long, thick taproot of a burdock. He found a wild onion. He returned to the small, exhausted group, his arms full. He took his steel water bottle, the last of his clean water, and built a small crude fire with a lighter he'd taken from a dead man. He sliced the burdock root, minced the onion, and put it all in the water to boil, creating a thin but hot, mineral-rich soup. He steeped the clover flowers for a weak, sweet tea. He served it to them in their empty plastic water bottles. They drank. It was the first hot food, the first new calories they had consumed in days. It was bitter, strange, and thin. It was the most delicious thing any of them had ever tasted. He got Sarah to her feet. They walked another 10 miles until they were stopped by a military roadblock. It was a remnant, a National Guard unit holding a bridge. They were taken to a refugee camp, which had been set up at a local surviving university that had its own power grid. It was there that a haggard-looking, desperate General Miller, coordinating with the last scientist he had, Dr. Eva Rostova, found him. "You're Elias Thorne?" the general asked. "The chef?" Elias, his hands still caked in dirt, just nodded. "Good," Miller said. "We've got a problem. Dr. Rostova here says the planet is still edible, but no one knows how to eat it. They're starving because they think the only food in the world is what comes in a box. You're a folk hero, Thorne. You're the most famous chef on the planet." Elias looked at his ruined hands. "I was a chef, General. Now I'm just hungry." "No," Eva said, stepping forward, her eyes bright with a frantic scientific zeal. "You're the most important man in the world. You're not a chef. You're the quartermaster of this entire war, and you're going to teach us all how to scavenge." The Scavengers' Crusade had its name, its mission, and its first unwilling and deeply cynical leader. On the bridge of the abundant harvest in the cold, silent void beyond the human moon, High Provisioner Varrock observed the passing of Day 45. This was, according to Krell doctrine, the precise midpoint of the siege. It was the collapse phase. By this point in the 23 previous corrections, the target species' planetary communication grid would be flooded with a rising, panicked chorus of desperation. Centralized governments, their power broken by the starvation of their populace, would be broadcasting frantic, incoherent pleas for terms. The societal structure would be a hollow, rotting edifice, ready to be gently pushed over, its survivors grateful for the benevolent, orderly intervention of the Krell. Varrock settled into his bioluminescent observation throne, his six-fingered, hands laced patiently, and prepared to analyze the satisfying, predictable sounds of a world coming to its logical end. The bridge was silent. There was no panicked chorus. There were no frantic pleas. The global communications grid of Earth was, as predicted, completely dark. This in itself was not an anomaly. The first-stage resource riots and the failure of the biofuel-dependent electrical grid had been perfectly calculated. The Nul-Blight had performed flawlessly. The silence was, in fact, a sign of total systemic failure. And yet, the silence was wrong. It was not the silence of a species waiting to die. It was the silence of a household where the occupants have, without notice, simply packed their bags and left. "Report." Varrock chimed, his voice a soft, resonant note in the sterile air. "Display atmospheric and thermal anomalies." A logic artisan, its tall, slender form moving with practiced grace, brought up the planetary holograph. "High Provisioner. The primary metrics are nominal. The Poshi family is at 0.0% global presence. The societal infrastructure collapse is at 98.7%, as projected." The artisan paused, a flicker of its bioluminescent skin the only sign of its deep, logical confusion. "But the secondary variables are irregular. We are detecting a mass decentralized exodus from the primary urban centers. This is a counterintuitive response. Logic would dictate the populous huddles near the established, albeit empty, food distribution hubs." Varrock focused on the thermal display. The map of Earth, which should have been growing cold, was instead peppered with a million pinpricks of new, inefficient heat sources. "Atmospheric analysis," Varrock commanded. The display shifted. "Carbon dioxide levels are erratic, but rising. We are detecting a catastrophic spike in atmospheric particulates consistent with the inefficient combustion of aged carbon cellulose. Wood smoke. Vrak chimed, his voice a flat, uncomprehending note. They are burning their trees. This was a profound tactical absurdity. Why would a starving species expend its last fading energy reserves on the large-scale, decentralized felling of forests? It was a chaotic, primitive, and utterly illogical expenditure. The logic artisan brought up another feed, this one a high-spectrum audio analysis. The planetary soundscape, stripped of its electronic hum, was not silent. It was filled with the low-frequency, chaotic rumble of millions of primitive internal combustion engines, salvaged and running on crude, distilled biofuels. And beneath that, a new, dominant sound. The sharp, rhythmic, metallic sound of chopping and digging. They are not dying, the logic artisan stated, its voice a perfect, synthesized monotone that could not conceal the logical paradox it was presenting. They are gardening, and they are building shelters. They have, in essence, abandoned their entire global infrastructure in a matter of weeks and reverted to a pre-industrial, scattered tribal state. This response was not within the projected parameters of the simulation. Vrak laced his long fingers. This was inefficient, messy. He had expected a clean, centralized surrender, a single logical mind begging for intervention. Instead, the single large dying creature he had been observing had fractured into a million tiny, frantic, and infuriatingly busy organisms. He had not killed the civilization. He had merely, and inconveniently, shattered it. This changes nothing, Vrak chimed, his logic reasserting itself. They are disorganized, they are animals grubbing in the dirt. Their new food, whatever it may be, is inefficient and unsustainable. They are simply prolonging the inevitable. The collapse will still come. It will just be untidy. He settled back into his throne. The math in the long run was still the math. He would wait. Elias Thorne, his face smeared with a mixture of sweat and the rich red-brown sludge of the dead earth, was no longer a chef. He was a prophet. His new temple was the ruined, muddy expanse of the university's central quad, a place that had once been a perfectly manicured, useless green lawn. Now it was a field of chaotic, hopeful, and deeply ugly possibility. His first act as the new quartermaster of the apocalypse, as he'd grimly begun to call himself, was to bulldoze the entire quad, mixing the dead, nitrogen-rich slime of the Poshi into the soil beneath, creating a super-fertilized bed of raw potential. His second act was to take over the campus's defunct student-run radio station. It was a primitive analog relic, its broadcast tower a simple spike of rust-red metal, powered by a grumbling diesel-powered generator. It was perfect. General Miller had given him a single, clear order. Thorne, your Michelin stars don't mean a damn thing to me. But you know food, and you know how to talk about it. We have millions of people out there starving because they are standing in a field of food and they think it's weeds. You are no longer a chef. You are a teacher. Now go to work. Elias sat in the small, padded, soundproof room, a single old-fashioned microphone in front of him. He took a deep breath. He thought of his perfect, clean, stainless steel kitchen, now a burned-out husk. He thought of the delicate, almost transparent, slices of harami he used to serve, the perfectly tempered chocolate, the sauces that took 3 days to make, and then he looked at the muddy, gritty, and profoundly alive burdock root he held in his hand. He clicked the microphone on. This is Elias Thorne. His voice crackled over the high-frequency bands, a single, defiant voice in the global silence. You might know me, you might not, it doesn't matter. What matters is that you are probably hungry and you are probably right now standing less than 10 feet from your next meal. You have been told your entire life that food comes from a box or a bag. You have been lied to. Food is dirt. It is the land. It is the story of where you are, and our story has just changed. Thus began the scavenger's gospel. It was not a plea for hope. It was a furious, practical, and deeply detailed instruction manual. Look outside, he commanded, his voice a low, gravelly growl. You see that yellow flower that ruins your lawn? That's Taraxacum, dandelion. You are going to pick the young, tender leaves. You are going to boil them twice to remove the bitterness, Or if you're a savage like me, you'll eat them raw and enjoy the bite. It will keep you alive. The root, you're going to dig it up, you're going to scrub it, you're going to roast it until it's black, and then you're going to grind it. It's not coffee, but it's hot, it's black, and it's here. And that's all that matters. His broadcast was a sensation. It was a lifeline. In refugee camps, in barricaded suburbs, in the shells of dead cities, people huddled around salvaged, hand-cranked radios. They listened. He moved on. That broad-leafed thing growing in the cracks of the sidewalk, plantago, plantain. The leaves are tough, but they are full of nutrients. Stew them. Mash them into a poultice for your infected cuts. It's food, and it's medicine. He covered trifolium, clover, its flowers a source of sweet protein-rich tea. He covered amaranthus, pigweed, its leaves a better, more nutritious version of spinach. Its seeds a grain that could be ground into a coarse, heavy flour. He was single-handedly rebooting the hunter-gatherer phase of human civilization, live, on air. He was giving them not just calories, but permission. Permission to eat the world that was left, to see the weeds not as a sign of decay, but as a sign of defiant, stubborn life. He was teaching them to be scavengers. He was teaching them to be human. The alliance between Elias Thorne and Dr. Eva Rostova was forged in the fire of a shared, desperate purpose. Elias was the what, the populist voice, the man who could look at a ditch and see a 5-course meal. Eva was the how, the cold, methodical scientific mind who could turn his folk wisdom into a scalable, industrial doctrine. Her lab at Fort Detrick, now the scientific capital of the New World, became the nerve center for the Scavenger Corps, the new military branch general Miller had established. Their new motto stitched onto their uniforms was simple: "We reap." "Elias, you're a madman," Eva said, her voice crackling over the hard line that now connected their two compounds. She was holding up a test tube of a thick green-brown liquid. "I did the analysis on the stinging nettle you're having everyone boil." "And?" Elias asked, sipping his burdock root coffee. "And it's a miracle. The Nul-Blight." "The Krell made a mistake, Elias. A profound one." She explained. The retrovirus in its total annihilation of the Poaceae family had not just removed the competition. The sludge that the grasses had dissolved into was a perfect, nitrogen-rich, pre-digested fertilizer, and it had been absorbed into the soil on a global scale. The Nul-Blight was a smart plague, Eva explained, her voice electric with discovery. It's programmed to keep the soil sterile, but only for Poaceae. For everything else, it's the most effective fertilizer in the history of the planet. The weeds that Elias was finding were not just weeds. They were superfoods. The amaranth had a protein content that was off the charts. The stinging nettles had more iron and vitamin C than any baseline domestic crop. The dandelions were so packed with vitamins that they were essentially a multivitamin pill with roots. The Krell's perfect surgical strike had failed. It had inadvertently created a global, chaotic, and unimaginably fertile garden. The planet was not dying. It was thriving in a new, ugly, and profoundly resilient way. This discovery changed everything. The Scavenger Corps, under General Miller's command, shifted from being armed guards to being the world's new farmers. But they weren't planting the old, fragile monoculture crops. They were cultivating the new ones. They established vast, protected, chaotic farms of potatoes, a crop the Krell's narrow logic had completely ignored. They cultivated massive fields of soybeans, beans, and lentils, and most importantly, they began to domesticate the superweeds, amaranth, quinoa, and kale. These plants were robust, fast-growing, and required almost no specialized care. They wanted to grow. They were the perfect crops for an apocalyptic world. Elias's broadcasts shifted in tone. He was no longer just a scavenger. He was, once again, a chef. "You have potatoes." His voice now boomed with a new, stronger confidence. "You have wild onions. You have stinging nettles. You are not a refugee. You are a chef. And you are going to make a vichyssoise. You are going to boil the potatoes and onions until they are soft. You are going to blanch the nettles to remove the sting. You are going to blend it all together You're going to find flavor, you're going to find joy. They tried to starve us. They thought food was just a fuel. We are going to show them that it is our soul. He was teaching a starving, broken world, not just how to survive, but how to live again, one defiant, improvised, and absolutely delicious meal at a time. The Scavengers' Crusade was no longer just about survival. It was about culture. Day 90. The chronometer on the bridge of the abundant harvest chimed, a soft, polite, three-note chord. This was the day, the logical, foregone conclusion. The human civilization, having exhausted its last frantic reserves, would now be broadcasting its unconditional surrender. High Provisioner Varak adjusted his ceremonial robes. He was prepared to be benevolent, to show the defeated, starving remnants the true, harmonious path of the Krell. Open all receiving channels, he chimed. Monitor for the human surrender protocols. The bridge was silent. The logic artisan at the communications console monitored the chaotic, messy, low-frequency radio chatter from the planet below. There were no surrender protocols. There were no pleas for mercy. Vrak's large, dark eyes narrowed. What, he asked, is the dominant broadcast signal? The artisan hesitated. High Provisioner, it appears to be a recipe for something called 5-weed frittata. Vrak's placid, logical mind was, for the first time in his life, incapable of processing the data. A recipe. A frittata. He demanded a full, deep-spectrum, atmospheric and biological analysis of the planet. The abundant harvest hummed, its powerful passive sensors tasting the air, analyzing the soil, scanning the biological heat signatures of the surviving populace. The report that came back was not a strategic analysis. It was a philosophical refutation. The human biosigns were not at the projected 15% of baseline. They were at 85%. They were not starving. Their nutritional intake was, in fact, more varied and vitamin-rich than the pre-blight baseline. The planetary atmosphere was not cooling. It was warming, thick with the wood smoke of a million new, small, thriving communities. Vrak demanded a visual. He targeted a high population zone, the Camp Resurgam his sensors had identified as the source of the frittata broadcast. The image that resolved on his holographic display was not a scene of gaunt, dying refugees. It was a bustling, chaotic, thriving town. He saw vast, ugly, disorganized fields of amaranthus, Solanum tuberosum, and brassica. He saw smoke rising from hundreds of crude, outdoor kitchens. He saw human soldiers, their bodies lean but muscular, training, hauling timber, and guarding the fields. He saw in a central courtyard the man Elias Thorne, standing over a massive, wood-fired paella pan, giving a cooking demonstration to a crowd of hundreds. But it was the chemical analysis that finally, and irrevocably, broke Vrak's logic. His sensors analyzed the food being prepared: porphyra, seaweed, Agaricus bisporus, common mushroom, and Tenebrio molitor, the mealworm. They are eating the fungus, the logic artisan whispered, its synthesized voice trembling. They are eating the insects. They are eating the ocean weeds. Vrak stared at the screen, at the image of a human soldier cheerfully biting into a roasted, skewered grub. The Krell, as a species, were defined by their biological specialization. They ate one thing. Their entire philosophy of war was built on this weakness. They had projected their own singular vulnerability onto their enemy. They had assumed, with perfect, flawless, and suicidal logic, that humanity was just like them. Vax's world shattered. He was not a doctor correcting a wayward patient. He was a fool who had tried to starve a creature that would and could eat anything. The Nul-Blight had not been a scalpel. It had been an act of global, unintended gardening. He had not created a famine. He had merely, and at great effort, changed the menu. He looked at the vibrant, messy, thriving, grub-eating, weed-farming, fungus-cooking planet below. The siege had failed. The logic was a lie. This was not a correction. This was a war against the most terrifyingly adaptable species in the known galaxy. This was a war he could not win with logic. His hands, no longer placid, trembled as he opened a channel to the Krell High Command. His benevolence was gone. His pity was gone. Only a cold, profound, and deep-seated horror remained. "Provisioner General Virak to High Command," he chimed, his voice a low, broken, and defeated note. "The Nul-Blight protocol has failed. The subject is Omnivore. I am requesting the immediate deployment of the purification fleet. This species cannot be corrected. It must be cleansed. With fire." The Krell High Command, having received Virak's horrifying report, did not waste time with new strategies. They fell back on the one ancient pre-logic doctrine they had hoped never to use again: purification. If a pest could not be starved, it must be burned. The abundant harvest, a vessel of science and correction, was recalled in disgrace. In its place, a new fleet tore a hole in space-time and arrived in Earth orbit. These were not the elegant, seed-like biovessels. These were the ships from the dark, forgotten history of the Krell, the purification fleet. They were massive, brutalist blocks of a dull, non-reflective metal, their surfaces scarred and pitted. They were warships, pure and simple, and their primary function was to deliver overwhelming kinetic and thermal energy. On the planet's surface, the world's new, chaotic, and thriving society felt the change immediately. The first strike was not a subtle genetic whisper. It was a roar. A single massive tungsten rod, a kinetic gift from the lead dreadnought, the Righteous Correction, was dropped from orbit. It struck the Pacific Ocean, 1,000 miles west of any coastline. The resulting tsunami was a global catastrophe, a wall of water that scoured coastlines on every continent, wiping out the new thriving coastal communities that had been built on harvesting seaweed, kelp, and the ocean's bounty. It was a message written in the language of pure, indiscriminate physical power. We are no longer asking, we are telling. In the fortified university campus of Camp Resurgam, Elias Thorne, General Miller, and Dr. Eva Rostova watched the seismological reports come in over their makeshift hard-lined network. The joyful, defiant energy of their new world evaporated, replaced by a cold, hard dread. "They're not playing anymore," Miller stated, his voice a low growl. "They're done with the siege. This is an extermination." The Krell fleet began to systematically cleanse the new large-scale agricultural zones. Low-yield plasma batteries rained down from orbit not to destroy cities but to incinerate the vast new chaotic fields of potato, amaranth, and soy. The Krell, having failed to starve humanity with precision, were now resorting to a crude, brute-force scorched earth campaign. "We can't fight them in orbit," Miller said, stating the obvious. "We have no fleet. We have no anti-orbital weapons. They can sit up there and burn us continent by continent until we're back to grub eaters in caves." "No," Eva said, her eyes fixed on the data. "They're not just burning. Look at the patterns. They're landing. They're deploying ground troops." She was right. The orbital bombardment was just the prelude, a way to clear the landing zones. The Krell, for all their newfound brutality, were still a species obsessed with process. They would not just burn the planet. They would sweep it, on foot, to ensure the Nul-Blight's failure was properly and methodically erased. "They're coming down," Elias whispered, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the console. "They're coming down to our level. They're coming down into the kitchen." A grim, terrible smile spread across his face. "They have no idea what a mistake they've just made. They're bringing their sterile, perfect, logical war down into the dirt, and the dirt is our turf." The Krell ground troops were called purifiers. They were a caste that had not been activated in centuries, a biological throwback to a more savage time. They were 8 feet tall, encased in sleek, pale gray environmental suits, their bodies artificially enhanced for a single purpose: combat. They were, in essence, Krell, who had been surgically and genetically forbidden from the placid, logical life of their masters. They were fast, strong, and armed with plasma pulse rifles that could turn a man to ash. They deployed from massive, sterile landing craft, stepping out into the chaotic, filthy wilderness of the new Earth with a palpable, programmed disgust. Their mission was simple: find the pockets of human resistance, the static that Varak had failed to account for and erase them. Their first target was Camp Resurgam. A full battalion of purifiers, 500 strong, advanced on the university campus, their movements precise, their formations perfect. They expected to encounter a disorganized, half-starved rabble of primitives. They were met, instead, by the Scavenger Corps. General Miller, a master of 21st century warfare, had turned the entire overgrown campus into a three-dimensional death trap. The Krell, logical and precise, advanced through the main quadrangles and access roads, the most efficient paths. They were met by a species that had been raised on the concept of asymmetrical warfare. The scavengers did not engage in a pitched battle. They engaged in 100 tiny, vicious ones. They emerged from sewer grates, from ivy-covered dormitory windows, from tunnels dug through the new dense thickets of amaranth. They fought with salvaged, solid projectile weapons, which were surprisingly effective against the Krell's energy-optimized armor. But their true weapons were those of a scavenger. They used Eva's improvised chemical bombs, which gummed up the joints of the Krell's environmental suits. They used traps, primitive but effective, punji pits filled with sharpened rebar, deadfalls made from salvaged statues, and tripwires connected to improvised claymore mines. The Krell's purifiers were logical. They were efficient. They could not process an enemy that would willingly collapse an entire burning building on a single enemy squad. They could not understand a soldier who would charge, not with a rifle, but with 2 cans of gasoline and a lit flare, turning himself into a human-sized Molotov cocktail. The Scavenger Corps was not a professional army. It was a horde of feral, desperate, and terrifyingly creative survivors, fueled by a diet of high-energy weeds and a profound, burning hatred for the aliens who had tried to starve their children. The battle for Camp Resurgam was a brutal, grinding, and bloody affair. The humans took staggering losses, but they inflicted a toll the Krell had never anticipated. For every scavenger who fell, a Krell purifier was dragged down, its perfect sterile suit breached, its body exposed to the filthy, pollen-choked, bacteria-rich air of Earth, to which it had zero immunity. The Krell, for all their power, were fighting on a planet that was itself a biological weapon. Elias Thorne was not a soldier. He was a chef, and he saw the battle not in terms of tactics but of logistics. He and Eva Rostova had been in the command bunker, watching the combat feeds, and they both saw the same critical detail. The Krell purifiers did not scavenge. They did not eat the local weeds. They did not even carry rations. They were, like their masters, highly specialized. They were tethered by some unseen logistical chain to their main base. Every 12 hours they would fall back in perfect, synchronized squads to their landing craft, where they would presumably be rearmed, decontaminated, and refed. They're still on a leash, Elias said, his mind racing. They're fighting in our world, but they're not living in it. They're still bringing their own goddamn pantry to the dinner party. We can't break their supply line. Elias, General Miller grunted, pointing to the orbital display. Their landing craft are supplied directly from the dreadnoughts. We can't stop them from resupplying. We can only bleed them on the ground. You're thinking like a soldier, General, Eva said. Her eyes lit with the same cold, analytical fire that Elias felt. You're thinking about stopping the delivery, but what if we don't stop the delivery? What if we spoil the food? The Krell's primary base of operations, their main foothold on the continent, was a massive, sterile, prefabricated compound they had established in the ruins of what was once Washington, D.C. It was here, in a heavily fortified, climate-controlled, and sterile central warehouse, that they stored the processed, crystalline nutrient paste that fueled their entire ground army. It was the single most important and most heavily guarded building on the planet, and Elias and Eva had just decided to poison the well. But they wouldn't use a chemical. The Krell were master geneticists. Their sensors would detect any common poison. They had to use something they would never ever see coming. Elias, Eva asked, a slow, terrifying smile spreading across her face. How much do you know about Aspergillus oryzae? Elias blinked. Koji, the mold, it's the basis for everything. Soy sauce, miso, sake, it's a miracle. It breaks down proteins and starches into sugars and glutamates. It's the engine of flavor. Exactly, Eva said, pulling up a new, terrifying genetic model. It's an engine, and the Krell's nutrient paste is a crystalline protein matrix. It's a complex, locked-up starch. To a normal organism, it's inedible. But to a strain of koji that has been encouraged, a strain that has been gene-spliced with a hyper-aggressive, acid-resistant fungus and given a reproductive cycle of about 15 minutes. It's not just food. It's a feast. It's an all-you-can-eat buffet. The plan was no longer a military one. It was a mission of strategic, biological, and culinary sabotage. They were not going to plant a bomb. They were going to infect the Krell's entire food supply with a hyper-aggressive, weaponized flavor mold. They were going to turn the Krell's pantry into a single, massive, fuzzy, fermenting vat of inedible gray-green mush. The mission was a suicidal act of culinary terrorism. Elias Thorne, the man who had once charged $1,000 for a prix-fixe menu, now led a team of 10 scavengers, including General Miller's best operatives, on a desperate infiltration of the Krell's central compound. They moved through the sewers of the dead capital, a maze of filth and history, while Miller's main forces launched a massive, diversionary, and ultimately doomed frontal assault on the compound's perimeter to draw the Purifier's attention. Elias and his team, carrying nothing but their sidearms and a single hermetically sealed lead-lined canister, slipped through the base's nutrient waste pipes, their one-way entry into the heart of the enemy's logistical chain. They emerged into the Krell's central warehouse. It was a cathedral of sterility. Vast, white, and silent, the air scrubbed and cold, and in the center, stacked on perfect, logical, anti-seismic shelves, were thousands of large crystalline cylinders containing the Krell's pale blue nutrient paste. This was the lifeblood of their entire army. "Do it," Elias whispered. Eva's specialist, a bioengineer who had once worked at Fort Detrick, nodded grimly. She unsealed the canister. Inside was not a bomb. It was a single fist-sized, fuzzy, grayish-green brick of rice, a koji mother of unimaginable virulence. She placed it in the central air circulation duct for the warehouse, sprayed it with a small atomizer of a sterile, glucose-based solution to wake it up, and sealed the grate. The spores, invisible to the Kloop's sensors, were instantly and efficiently distributed throughout the entire, sterile chamber by the Krell's own perfect air conditioning. The team escaped just as the diversionary attack failed. Miller's forces, pulling back, having paid a terrible price in blood for the few precious minutes Elias needed. They waited. For 12 hours, nothing happened. Then on the Krell's bridge, a sensor alarm, one that had never been used before, began to chime. It was not a radiation alarm or a toxin alarm. It was a microbial count alarm. In the central warehouse, the koji, fueled by the sterile, humid air in the untapped ocean of crystalline starch, was having an evolutionary field day. The mold was replicating at a geometric rate, its powerful enzymes attacking the Krell's food, breaking down the complex proteins into a bubbling, fermenting, and utterly useless sludge that smelled, vaguely, of rotten peaches and soy sauce. High Provisioner, Frak, who had been transferred to the Righteous Correction to oversee the purification, watched in abject, mind-numbing horror as a live feed from his pristine warehouse showed his army's entire food supply, his perfect, logical, sterile nutrient paste, being visibly devoured by a carpet of thick, fuzzy, greenish-gray mold. His purifiers on the front line, their 12-hour nutritional cycle broken, began to falter. Their advanced bodies, so perfectly tuned, had no reserves. They were like high-performance engines that had just been fed a tank of sugary water. Xiaotiao, the field, their systems collapsed. They fell to their knees, their suits reporting critical systemic metabolic failure. They were starving. They were starving to death in a matter of hours while standing on a planet that Elias Thorne had just proven was a global, chaotic, and overflowing garden. The purification fleet, its entire ground army neutralized by a condiment, had no choice. Frak's logic, his civilization's entire philosophy, was not just defeated, it was eaten. The Krell, a species that could not adapt, that could not eat a dandelion, that could not conceive of a mushroom had been defeated by a species that would eat anything and would even weaponize the very process of flavor to do it. The surrender was broadcast on all channels, a broken, defeated, and terrified chime. Elias Thorne, his crusade over, returned to Camp Resurgam. He stood at his radio transmitter, a new, strange, and beautiful ingredient in his hand. A single, intact captured canister of the Krell's pale blue crystalline nutrient paste, the only one to survive the Koji bloom. He clicked on the microphone. "This is Elias Thorne," he said to the world. "The war is over, and tonight, I am going to teach you all a new recipe. I'm calling it Alien Miso Glazed Roasted Amaranth. It turns out, the bastards are edible after all.